The ancient Egyptians tell us in many of their records that everything they knew was a legacy. That all their knowledge was based on the legacy of the gods, which made their cultural rise and the construction of monumental buildings possible in the first place. But what if the mysterious bringers of civilization were not divine beings at all, but a people so advanced that they were summarily attributed a supernatural origin? There are a number of ancient traditions and archaeological finds that cast serious doubt on the official historiography. But could it be that the relics of a long-lost advanced civilization are actually lying dormant in the hot desert sands, exposing everything we have learned in history class as a mistake? A quick search reveals that Egypt is home to around 118 pyramids, but a quick search also reveals that the borders of ancient Nubia are home to more than 200 of these iconic structures. So while most of the world's pyramids can be found in modern-day Sudan, the spotlight of historians continues to fall unabated on the colossal structures of the Giza Plateau. At the same time, the relevant specialist articles state that the stone giants were carved out of the ground around 4,500 years ago. But before we get the wrong idea, this is by no means a confirmed fact, but merely a historical assessment. The question of when exactly the Giza pyramids were built can no longer be answered with absolute certainty, and the same applies to the construction and transportation techniques used. In view of this vague starting position, it is therefore not really surprising that experts often use words such as estimated or probably in their explanations of the Pharaonic Empire. In line with this, however, there are also some discoveries and indications that suggest that the history of the oldest, greatest, and most mysterious witnesses of the past actually goes back much further than generally assumed. And we are not talking about a discrepancy of a few decades or centuries, but a historical discrepancy of several millennia. With the information in mind that the era of the ancient Egyptians only officially began around the year 3000 BC, many a skeptical mind comes to the conclusion that the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire could not have created the Giza buildings at all. In truth, we are dealing with the relics of a much older civilization that has been completely erased from our historical memory over time. But what is the background to this hotly disputed theory? Well, to understand this, it is worth taking a closer look at a very strange artifact that most people have probably never heard of. Recovered in 1907 in the Nubian desert in the tomb of the Naquata culture, it initially appears to be nothing more than an inconspicuous painted ostrich egg. But while the Naquata culture flourished in Upper Egypt at the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, on closer inspection, the Nubian egg is adorned with several depictions that leave us with raised eyebrows. For although the age of the find is estimated at a remarkable 7,000 years, it seems to show us the Great Pyramids of Giza. A historical anomaly or a modern misinterpretation? But how is that even possible? How can an object depict something that was actually created 2,500 years later? Well, if you ask the conservative researchers, the answer is, it can't, and it doesn't. According to them, the strange triangles adorned with transverse lines are nothing more than a highly simplified representation of a mountain range. End of story. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. After all, this explanation also raises a few questions. For example, what is the story behind the striking lines, which are not exactly typical for mountains? And what if we also look at the mountains that we actually find in Sudan? The whole thing becomes even trickier. Is the ostrich egg supposed to show us the mighty Dariba caldera, over 3,000 meters high? Or another massif in the east? Assuming the appropriate imagination, the formations are probably most reminiscent of the Al-Taka Mountains. But the fact that they also suggest artificially created pyramids cannot be denied either. Just like the decorations on the eggshell, the Nubian pyramids also have an extremely pointed character. In view of this, could it not be that the ancient inhabitants of Nubia merely immortalized some of their own buildings artistically? Well, not really. After all, the Nubian pyramids were only built 2,000 years after the Egyptian pyramids. Despite this, it appears that the illustrations have the typical appearance of a classic pyramid. They consist of individual steps that taper towards the top. How likely the mountain theory appears against this background is something that everyone has to decide for themselves, but this is by no means all. In fact, the Nubian egg also presents us with other paintings that leave plenty of room for speculation. For example, the zigzagging structure to the right of the supposed pyramids is something suspected to represent the Nile. There is no doubt that the mighty river repeatedly takes a few detours on its way to the Mediterranean. And just as depicted on the egg, the Nile also lies to the right or east of the Giza Plateau. However, we should perhaps note at this point that the Nile no longer has the course and shape it had 7,000 years ago. We should therefore not assume that the depiction of the Nile on the egg corresponds to that of modern maps. And it goes without saying that we are not dealing with a geographically perfect map, but with a rudimentary drawing on an eggshell. The bottom line is that we have only looked at one side of the artifact so far, but the other side also contains some controversial illustrations. On the one hand, we are once again confronted with a pyramid-like formation, and on the other, with a depiction that could turn out to be another landscape reference. In detail, this is said to be the Fayum Basin, a large oasis west of the Nile. However, the most spectacular feature of the Nubian ice is probably on its upper side. Unbelievable but true, some people are firmly convinced that the trail of the artifact leads straight to the legendary Atlantis. On the trail of the legend. As you can easily see, the spot in question is adorned with a circular ring structure. Yes, and where could something similar have caught our eye before? Well, in the ancient legend of a certain Plato, of course. According to the ancient myth, the main island of Atlantis is said to have consisted of 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land. And although it was the famous Greek philosopher who spread the legend, its origins are said to lie in ancient Egypt. Some experts speculate that Plato himself learned of this legend in Egypt, but the skeptical camp counters that Plato's trip to Egypt is fundamentally controversial and that he could not even read hieroglyphics. But despite this, it is possible that the Nubian egg not only reveals the true age of the Egyptian pyramids and possibly also the existence of a lost civilization, but also confirms the authenticity of a tradition that most researchers dismiss as a fictitious myth. Well, even if these interpretations are exciting, we should not forget that they are just that, interpretations that, in the absence of further archaeological evidence, we should not confuse with facts. We simply do not know what motifs were really behind the painting on the ostrich egg. What we do know, however, is that this artifact is by no means the only find that sometimes causes conservative historians a lot of trouble. This discovery contradicts the official age of the Pyramid of Khufu. Mystical funerary text, magnificent grave goods, and of course a millennia-old pharaoh's mummy. These are all the things that have not yet been discovered in the Pyramid of Khufu. The truth is that the pyramid's modest finds consist of just 3 objects: a granite sphere, a copper hook, and a few fragments of cedar wood. Nonetheless, this sparse list is enough to raise serious doubts about the official dating of the Great Pyramid. Specifically, this refers to the wood. Discovered together with other artifacts by Wayman Dixon in 1872, it was considered lost for decades. This only changed a few years ago when an observant member of the staff of the University of Aberdeen noticed that the irreplaceable artifacts had been lying dormant in a cigar box in the Asian department all this time. The wood was then subjected to professional radiocarbon dating, but amazingly, the analysis revealed that the fragments date from between 3341 and 3094 BC. In other words, the wood is 500 years older than the Pyramid of Khufu. Well, if you follow the general dating, of course. However, within the range of deviation taken into account, it is possible that the material is even 300 years older. But how do the experts try to put this confusing fact into a plausible context? What is a 5,000-year-old piece of wood doing in a 4,500-year-old pyramid? Well, one explanation is based on the fact that the wood was reused for half a millennium, as it was both a rare and precious commodity in ancient Egypt. If this is true, we could all take a leaf out of the pharaoh's book when it comes to recycling and sustainability. Another theory is that the ancient wood was deliberately placed in the pyramid to honor the pharaoh Cheops. The most plausible theory, however, is that the tree in question had already been around for several centuries when it was felled for lumber. After all, cedars can live for up to 1,000 years. But if we go back to the Nubian egg and the images immortalized on it, we can draw another conclusion. Wouldn't it be conceivable that the cedar wood was not placed in the pyramid 4,500 years ago, but significantly earlier, simply because the structure had already been completed for thousands of years at that time? But the biggest question is your click on the subscribe button already completed at that time? Join our community now and never miss an exciting video from us again.